Hey dudes, it's Llarold. Earlier this week, Blizzard gave official confirmation of the upcoming patch 11.1 release date. As I predicted in our last video, it is dropping on February 25th, and Season 2 is going to be landing a week later on March 4th. I feel pretty good about it. I mean, it was an easy guess, but I do feel pretty good about it. So now that we know, this is the time to go ahead and finish getting our characters ready and kind of deciding on what we're going to main, lock it in for the upcoming patch. And on that note, let's just go ahead and get right into the video. So I want to start with changes that are happening to tanks in the big patch here, and I would say that there's really one big great change that's happening. It was just released, at least as of the time of recording, earlier today. It's a pretty major damage increase for all of the tanks. For 4 of the tanks, they're getting 20% increased damage, and they have the same developer note for all of them. We felt the tanks weren't keeping up with DPS specs. Correct. So for DK, DH, Druid, and Warrior, it's 20%, and there's a little bit of extra stuff for like Vengeance DH. It's getting a little bit more burst, Demon Surge damage, a little bit more burst damage. And then for Monk and for Paladin, it's only 15%, so this is okay, right? Paladin has been significantly ahead of the rest of the pack when it comes to damage as a tank in Mythic Plus. They're like 30% ahead of the second place performer, and that second place performer is Monk, so it makes sense that Paladin wouldn't get quite as much of a buff. And then Monk, I guess they just kind of get cast in there, guilty by association. In terms of single target raid damage, neither of these two specs is actually all that great. I would say they're both middle of the pack, or maybe even a little bit lower, so I think them not keeping up with some of the top performers in single target raid damage, like Blood DK, is a little bit of a head scratcher. In terms of other changes, I think the main thing that's happening in the upcoming patch is that Warrior is being slowed down quite a bit. They've really gone through a lot of iteration on this, like a lot of iteration. Shield Slam's reset proc chance was cut from 30% down to 20%, then bumped back up to 25%. The class has around 30% less rage generation than it did before the patch, but it has gained about 35% more ignore pain absorption per cast. Revenge talents have also been buffed. Revenge is going to feel like a more useful global cooldown. And then another big change is that Devastator's chance to reset Shield Slam, wow, that is a tongue twister, has been increased by 5%. It's gone from the baseline of 20% up to 25%. Now that might be a bug, who can say? Either way, despite a rocky initial reception on the Warrior Rage nerfs, because Blizzard, I feel, went way too far off the bat, I actually think the class is going to come through the patch just fine. The feedback was super negative initially, then they pulled back on that a lot, and then they pulled back some more, and I think the middle ground that they've wound up on is pretty good. Warrior genuinely did have more rage than it could reasonably spend at points. I would just be like, this is me playing Warrior all the time. Ignore Pain is just getting an absolute workout. And so is my Ignore Pain finger, and my Ignore Pain wrist, and Ignore Pain elbow and shoulder, and so on. So that's maybe not a great design, and that was kind of their justification for nerfing it, even though I actually liked how fast it was. Personally, I liked the amount of strain that it put on me to hit Ignore Pain over and over again. I can accept that something I enjoy isn't necessarily good. The only other significant change is that Monk has received a very small buff to Purified Chi. That's the bonus they get when they purify damage that then buffs their next Celestial Brew. Basically, it's a little bit faster to stack up to a full strength Celestial Brew. You only have to get up to 6 stacks as opposed to 10. I think that change won't really make much of a difference when it comes to Brewmaster's damage intake in Mythic Plus, and it's not really going to have a huge impact in Raid either. There are some other little changes along the way, but nothing really all that impactful. Alright, now let's move on to how all of the tanks have performed in Nerebar Palace, and I think this is actually a useful bit of metrics that we can measure, because there really haven't been much in the way of changes going into the next tier, and the tier set bonuses are, I wouldn't say exactly a wash, but they're not like a huge distinguishing factor between most of the tanks, other than I think the Pally and DK ones are pretty good, but I think the rest of the tier set bonuses are kind of whatevs. So just looking at the tanks, just overall performance in Raid, if we sort by 95th percentile, let's say 95th, just to kind of eliminate some cheesy behavior. If we just look at damage, Prop Pally and Blood DK are kind of standing above the rest if you look at the whole raid. Now, Prop Pally is really being propped up by a lot of the AoE fights, things like Bloodbound Horror to an extent, but like Brood Twister really puts them out in front. There's so many adds to AoE on. Rashomon, great movie, also a great padding boss fight. Silken Court, 2-target cleave, and then a lot of AoE potential. same kind of deal. But if you look at a pure single target fight, Prop Pally actually kind of falls down quite a bit on Kai'Veza, and Brewmaster Monk actually pulls ahead of them, but Blood DK stays strong. Blood DK is single target damage and their AoE cleave situation. Pretty good on both fronts. I think the one fight where they really kind of fall off, where there is a lot of AoE, is Brood Twister, and speaking from experience on that, I think a lot of that comes from, instead of using your cooldowns to really min-max damage, most players are in a situation where they kind of have to hold their A-Bomb limb and use it to provide CC, and you're kind of playing for CC on that fight a lot, so that kind of limits your damage potential in some kind of annoying ways that don't really apply to other tanks. Burden of having grips. But if we go to like Queen and Surek and we look, Prop Pally's not just out in front of the rest of the tanks, they're out in front by a massive, massive margin, and this isn't like some super small representation either. Like, Prop Pally's the third most played tank, and it is absolutely just blowing the brakes off of everything else. It's great in terms of damage output. Obviously, there's a lot of ad padding potential there, and, they're taking advantage of it. They're doing a great job blasting the ads in the intermission and maybe the ads in the final phase as well, just really slamming. So the other metric that we can use is just simply deaths, and I'd like to sort by top 10% of players, and then you can kind of look fight by fight, and you can see Monk does a really good job, you can see, especially on a fight like Ansurek or Kai'Veza. Monk is way out in front of the rest of the classes, and Blood DK is also pretty competitive in terms of tankiness, just in terms of not dying. Monk does a really good job on most of these fights that are more in the difficult range. Things like Kai'Veza, things like Queen Ansurek, they're really good. Where Monk actually kind of falls apart is Rashanan, because that fight does not play very nicely with Stagger, and it's really all about raw mitigation. Monk gets absolutely mollywopped on that fight, just brutalized, and Prot Warrior and Pally are actually much, much tankier on that fight. So I think Monk and DK are clear standouts, though, on the hard fights, the fights that really matter. They just stand head and shoulders above the rest. So in terms of utility, I'll just kind of use a little tier list here to kind of rank these all. I think that DK and Paladin really stand head and shoulders above the rest when it comes to unique raid utility that's available to them as a spec rather than just class utility. I also think, with that being said, that DK and Paladin are really pretty far ahead on class utility and raid as well. So the main things that they have: Blood has Gorfien's Grasp, protection. Paladin has Blessing of Spell Warding. It's really hard to overstate how useful Blessing of Spell Warding and Gorfien's Grasp can be in raid. They're just so much more valuable than any other thing that a tank can bring. The one downside to DK, I think, going into the next raid, is that there may not actually be that many ad fights like Brood Twister from Narrowbar Palace. There are some ads, but most of them couldn't be gripped in raid testing, so I think that's a pretty big issue for Blood. Not that it's going to hold him back. Now, on that note, I think EDH has Sigil of Chains. It's an acceptable alternative, nowhere near as good as the real thing. It's kind of like using vanilla extract in a recipe that calls for a whole vanilla bean or something. I don't know, I'm not a baker. The other three tanks basically have nothing going on in terms of group utility that isn't available to other specs of the class. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're like a failing grade, but they're about as close as you can be without failing. We'll call this like the D- tier. I wouldn't say that they exactly deserve a failing grade here, but I think D- is pretty perfect for where they belong. They're just a step above that compared to the rest. I think for Druid and Warrior in particular, there are DPS specs that are stronger than these classes in Raid generally that provide the same group utility. I think for Brewmaster Monk, that's not necessarily true, because Windwalker is kind of a mixed bag, but Mistweaver works, and it also brings the Monk debuff, and so I think Brewmaster doesn't really justify its existence in the way that Blood and Prot Paladin do. So taking all of that into account, I do think that this means that DK is probably the best tank in the next raid. Now, again, I'm just ranking their utility. I don't think I would put the tanks quite like this if I were actually ranking them all. And on all the factors, the tankiness from Brewmaster Monk certainly makes them a top 3 tank. They have the lowest rate of dying on the difficult fights, the fights that matter. I think that you can put them ahead of Paladin because of that. I don't think I would, but I think you could argue that. I think Druid and Warrior are definitely a cut below the rest, and I think Demon Hunter's kind of right in that middle of the pack range. I think that DK, though, clearly is the best. It is tanky, the damage is great, the tier set bonus is okay, but at least it isn't bugged. They have group utility that kind of alternates between mandatory and useless, but mandatory means mandatory, so it's really good to already be set and on a Blood DK if you suddenly realize you need death grips. You don't want to be trying to catch that thing up by 40 item levels at the last minute. Ask me how I've been there many tiers before, and it's the worst feeling in the world. I think it's hard to argue against Plague DK if you care primarily about rating. For me, I think Paladin is next, with Monk very close behind, and then I think the rest of the pack is a good step back from that. Now, when we switch over to talking about Mythic Plus, that's where things are nowhere near as competitive or egalitarian at all. Like, if we just look at all Mythic Plus levels, we're counting a plus 20 at the same level as a plus 2. It kind of looks like a decent spread, right? Like, Monk's a little underperforming, Paladin's a little overperforming, but if we even just go to, like, Mythic Plus level 12 and up, it's a bloodbath. There's no way around it, right? Prot Warrior is doing their best at second place, but they're like 1/4 as popular as Prot Paladin, and everything else is half as popular as that. And I think that a lot of that Prot Warrior holdover really does just come from them having been very good at the very start of the season. And, I think if we were to just filter this by like the last month or something, I think it's just basically pink from top to bottom. Now, if we go by Archon's damage values, which aren't, they're not necessarily gospel, but if we just sort by those in Mythic Plus, Prot Paladin is so far out in front in terms of damage output. Brewmaster Monk is less than 10%, less than 5% ahead even of the next highest in terms of damage, whereas Prot Pally, they're over 10% ahead of the number 2 place. Pretty crazy, the disparity between the haves and the have-nots, if you will. In terms of group utility, again, it's the same thing. The main differences in group utility from Raid to Mythic Plus is that Paladin's ability to spam interrupts, it's insanely strong. It has historically been insanely strong, but with the changes to monster interrupt behavior with the War Within, Paladin's value has absolutely skyrocketed. Sacrifice, spell warding, and the potential to provide off healing during intense moments are all also huge assets for any Mythic Plus group, and there's something that no other tank has access to at this level. There's also the shielding that comes from Lightsmith, which is the standard setup for playing a Paladin. I didn't even mention that in the raid section, but it does also apply there too. You have this ability to just put a major defensive cooldown on somebody every minute. It's just so easy to carry a group as a protection Paladin. No other tank compares. So Paladin is the best. I'll go back to my tier list here. Paladin's the best. Everything else is the rest. It's not up for debate. You couple their interrupts, their defensive group utility, their insane damage, final stand, their good tier set bonus, their good defensive cooldowns, and they're just the best tank for Mythic Plus. Absolutely zero question. Now, as for the rest of the pack, I actually think Warrior is in better shape than I think a lot of people, including myself, initially expected coming into the patch, but it's probably still going to see a drop-off in terms of popularity and performance just by being made slower. Even if it's actually better, I still think it's going to be less popular. I think Druid and DH are both very good. DK is okay. I like their 4-piece bonus, giving them Death Strike that cleaves. That's pretty fun. It'll probably remain popular, if we look at popularity levels in let's say the 10 and 11 range. DK is actually still fairly popular, more so than Bear, DH, and Monk, just simply because it's good in raids, very good, and you do need to run Mythic Plus to get gear for raids, so that's kind of it. And then there's Monk. It feels so flimsy in Mythic Plus. The damage is good, but not amazing, certainly not anywhere close to Prot Paladin, and the group utility is just extremely limited. You have Ring of Peace, Sweep, and Paralyze. You have a handful of crowd control skills, and that's it. And that isn't unique or powerful enough to compensate for Monk's limited defensive capabilities in Mythic Plus. It just takes so much more damage than every other tank, it needs more external healing than every other tank, and its cooldowns are weaker. It is undeniably a cut below the rest. So let's wrap up here. What tank do I think you should play in Season 2? Well, you can play whatever you want, whatever's fun to you. You can do that. But I will be playing Paladin. You can play something else if it makes you happy. That's fine. I would rather you be happy than unhappy, but if you want to be strong and you want to have an easier time getting invited into groups, there is a correct answer to the question, and that answer, at least right now, is Paladin. Now, maybe someday Blizzard will tune the other tanks to be competitive, but until then, it's Paladin time. Now, this might seem a little definitive or even sad that Paladin is so dominant, but I just want to nail this down before I wrap up. It's also insanely fun. I do think it is the most fun of the tanks, in addition to being the most strong. So this isn't bad that it's so good. It's more disappointed that the other tanks aren't both as good and as fun as Paladin is. Alright, I think that pretty much covers it. Patch 11.1 is coming soon, and Season 2 is coming with it. We are super excited about it. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and you want to see more like it. And if you want to support us even further, consider becoming a channel member. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.